Now let's talk about something many candidates underestimate for the exam, but that's very important in real-world cloud security: the security documentation AWS provides. AWS doesn't just give you security services. It also gives you extensive documentation, reports, and frameworks to help you design securely, prove compliance, and understand your responsibilities under the shared responsibility model. Let's go through the most important ones you need to know. AWS Artifact. AWS Artifact is the central place to access AWS compliance and security reports. Here, customers can download SOAK reports, PCI DSS reports, ISO certifications, agreements like the HIPAA Business Associate Addendum, BAA. This is extremely important for audits. AWS handles the infrastructure compliance, and you use these reports as evidence when auditors ask how your cloud environment is compliant. Exam tip: if a question asks, where do you download compliance reports or accept agreements like HIPAA BA? AWS Artifact is the answer. AWS Security Hub User Guide. The AWS Security Hub documentation explains how to aggregate and manage security findings across your AWS environment. Security Hub collects findings from GuardDuty, Inspector, Config, and other tools, shows compliance status against security standards, gives a single, centralized security dashboard. The user guide helps teams understand how to interpret findings and respond effectively. Exam tip: Security Hub does not detect threats itself. It aggregates and organizes findings. AWS Security Reference Architecture, AWS SRA. The AWS Security Reference Architecture is a blueprint for building secure AWS environments. It covers identity and access management, logging and monitoring, network protection, data protection, incident response. Think of it as a best practice security design, especially useful for large or regulated environments. Exam tip: if you see words like reference architecture, layered security, or security blueprint, so think about AWS SRA. AWS Well-Architected Framework, Security Pillar. The security pillar of the Well-Architected Framework focuses on how to design secure workloads. It emphasizes strong identity and access management, traceability with logs, data protection, infrastructure protection, automated incident response. This pillar helps teams ask the right security questions before deploying applications. Exam tip: well-architected is about design principles, not specific tools. AWS Risk and Compliance White Paper. This white paper explains AWS compliance programs, third-party audits, the shared responsibility model, how customers remain responsible for security in the cloud. It's a foundational document for understanding who is responsible for what. Exam tip: if a question is about responsibility boundaries or compliance understanding, this white paper is often referenced. Service-specific security documentation. Every AWS service, like IAM, VPC, S3, or Service Catalog, has its own security documentation. These guides explain secure configuration options, permission models, encryption features, common misconfigurations to avoid. They're essential for implementing least privilege and defense in depth. Exam tip: AWS expects customers to read and follow service-level security guidance. AWS Security Maturity Model. The AWS Security Maturity Model helps organizations evaluate and improve their security posture over time. It provides structured questions, guidance for different maturity levels, a roadmap for continuous security improvement. This is especially useful for organizations growing their cloud adoption. Exam tip. This model is about continuous improvement, not one-time setup. Data center security information. AWS also provides documentation about physical security in its global data centers. This includes access controls, environmental protections, monitoring and surveillance. Customers access this information through the AWS Compliance Center. Exam tip. AWS is always responsible for physical security of data centers. Key takeaway for the exam. AWS security is not just about tools, it's also about documentation, evidence, and frameworks. If the question mentions audits, so think about AWS Artifact. Security design, so think about AWS SRA, well-architected security pillar. Compliance responsibility, so think about risk and compliance white paper. Alright, so at this point, go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to read the question carefully and try to answer it on your own. Once you've made your choice, resume the video. Next, I'll walk you through a few clues to help you identify the correct answer. Before jumping to the answer, think about what the question is really asking. Key clues to focus on. The question mentions downloadable compliance reports. It specifically references third-party certifications like SOC, PCI, DSS, and ISO. These are official audit and compliance documents, not security alerts or blog content. The service must be a central, authoritative AWS source used during audits. Now, let's quickly eliminate the wrong options. AWS Security Hub. It aggregates security findings, not compliance reports. AWS Security Blog. It is an educational content, not official audit documents. AWS Knowledge Center. T is about troubleshooting articles and FAQs. The correct answer is AWS Artifact. AWS Artifact is the official AWS portal where customers can download compliance reports and agreements, including SOC 1, 2, 3 reports, PCI, DSS reports, ISO certifications, HIPAA, Business Associate Addendum, BAA. This is the service auditors expect you to use when proving compliance. For the AWS exam, remember this rule. If the question asks about compliance reports, certifications, or audit evidence, the answer is AWS Artifact. You'll see this pattern many times in the exam. Describing AWS security features and services, infrastructure protection, and threat detection. Now let's talk about how AWS helps you protect your infrastructure and detect threats in real time. This is a very important area for the Cloud Practitioner exam because AWS strongly emphasizes layered security, meaning you don't rely on just one control, but multiple services working together. AWS Web Application Firewall, AWS WAF protects web applications and APIs from common internet attacks. It sits in front of services like CloudFront, Application Load Balancer, and API Gateway, and inspects incoming HTTP and HTTPS requests. With AWS WAF, you can block or allow traffic based on rules such as SQL injection attempts, cross-site scripting, XSS, suspicious IP addresses, malicious bots. Example: if you run a public e-commerce website and attackers try to inject SQL commands through a login form, AWS WAF can automatically block those requests before they ever reach your application. Exam tip: if the question mentions protecting web apps or APIs from application layer attacks, think AWS WAF. AWS Shield. AWS Shield protects your applications from distributed denial of service (DDoS) attacks. There are two levels: Shield Standard, enabled automatically and free for all AWS customers. Protects against common, large-scale DDoS attacks. Shield Advanced, paid service with enhanced protections, cost protection, and access to the AWS DDoS Response Team, DRT. Shield works with services like CloudFront, Elastic Load Balancing, EC2, and Route 53. Example: if a massive traffic flood tries to overwhelm your public website, AWS Shield helps absorb and mitigate the attack so legitimate users can still access your service. Exam tip: if you see DDoS protection, the answer is AWS Shield. AWS Firewall Manager. AWS Firewall Manager is used for centralized security management across multiple AWS accounts. Instead of configuring WAF rules or firewall policies individually in each account, Firewall Manager lets you apply WAF rules, enforce Shield Advanced, manage AWS network firewall policies across all accounts in an AWS organization. Example: a large company with 20 AWS accounts can use Firewall Manager to ensure every account follows the same security rules without manual setup. Exam tip: if the question mentions centralized security policy management across accounts, think AWS Firewall Manager. Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon Guard Duty provides continuous threat detection. It analyzes VPC flow logs, CloudTrail events, DNS logs. Using machine learning and threat intelligence, Guard Duty detects things like compromised IAM credentials, unusual API activity, communication with known malicious IPs. Example: if an EC2 instance suddenly starts communicating with a known crypto mining server, Guard Duty can detect and alert you immediately. Exam tip: if the question mentions analyzing logs for suspicious behavior, the correct answer is Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon Inspector. Amazon Inspector focuses on vulnerability management, not live attacks. It automatically scans EC2 instances, container images in Amazon ECR. Inspector checks for known software vulnerabilities, CVEs, unintended network exposure, missing security patches. Example: if an EC2 instance is running outdated software with known vulnerabilities, Inspector identifies the risk and provides remediation guidance. Exam tip: if the question mentions finding vulnerabilities or missing patches, think Amazon Inspector. AWS Network Firewall. AWS Network Firewall is a managed, stateful firewall for your VPC. It allows you to filter inbound, outbound, and east-west traffic, create centralized firewall rules, inspect traffic at the network level, not just the application level. This is useful for protecting internal workloads and enforcing strict network segmentation. Example: you can prevent internal services from communicating with unauthorized external IP addresses, even if security groups are misconfigured. Exam tip: if the question talks about network-level traffic filtering inside a VPC, the answer is AWS Network Firewall. Alright, so at this point, go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to read the question carefully, and try to answer it on your own. Once you've made your choice, resume the video. Next, I'll walk you through a few clues to help you identify the correct answer. Now let's look at this next question, which is very common on the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. It focuses on threat detection and understanding which AWS service actively looks for malicious or suspicious behavior in your environment. As you think through this question, keep these clues in mind. The question mentions continuous threat detection, not just logging or configuration tracking. It specifically references VPC flow logs, DNS logs, and CloudTrail events. You're looking for a service that analyzes data automatically using intelligence or machine learning to identify suspicious activity. This is not a service that only records events, audits configurations, or reviews permissions. If a service only stores logs or tracks changes, it's probably not the right answer. The correct answer is Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon Guard Duty is AWS's managed threat detection service. It continuously analyzes VPC flow logs, DNS logs, and CloudTrail events using machine learning and threat intelligence to detect things like compromised credentials, unusual API calls, or suspicious network traffic. Why the other options are wrong? AWS config tracks configuration changes and compliance, not threats. AWS CloudTrail records API activity, but does not analyze it for malicious behavior. AWS IAM Access Analyzer focuses on identifying overly permissive access, not detecting attacks. For the exam, remember this shortcut. Logs plus ML-based threat detection equals Amazon Guard Duty. This pattern shows up again and again in Cloud Practitioner questions. Now let's bring everything together and talk about AWS security features and services, focusing on three major areas you must clearly understand for the AWS exam: identity and access management, data protection, and compliance and governance. Identity and access management, IAM. At the core of AWS security is Identity and Access Management, or IAM. IAM answers two critical questions: who can access AWS, and what they are allowed to do. With AWS IAM, you create and manage users, groups, roles, and permissions. Instead of giving everyone broad access, you define precise permissions using policies, following the principle of least privilege. For example, a developer might only need read access to S3, while an admin manages infrastructure. AWS IAM Identity Center, formerly AWS Single Sign-On, takes this a step further. It allows organizations to centrally manage workforce access across multiple AWS accounts and applications. Employees sign in once using corporate credentials and are granted access through permission sets mapped to IAM roles. This is the preferred approach for enterprise environments. To strengthen authentication, AWS supports multi-factor authentication, MFA. MFA adds an extra layer of security by requiring something you have, like a mobile authenticator app or hardware token, along with your password. MFA is especially critical for privileged users, and it is mandatory for the root user as a best practice. Exam tip: if a question mentions fine-grained permissions, least privilege, or who can do what, think IAM. Data protection. The next pillar is data protection, which ensures that sensitive information remains confidential, encrypted, and properly managed. AWS Key Management Service, KMS, is the backbone of encryption in AWS. It allows you to create, manage, rotate, and audit encryption keys used across services like S3, EBS, RDS, and Lambda. Most encryption at rest in AWS is integrated directly with KMS, making secure data handling much easier. Amazon Macie focuses specifically on data visibility and privacy. Using machine learning, Macie scans Amazon S3 buckets to discover and classify sensitive data such as personally identifiable information, PII, financial records, or credentials. This helps organizations understand where sensitive data lives and whether it's exposed. AWS Secrets Manager is designed to securely store and rotate secrets like database passwords, API keys, and tokens. Instead of hard-coding credentials into applications, which is a major security risk, Secrets Manager retrieves them securely at runtime and can automatically rotate them. Exam tip: encryption keys. Think KMS. Sensitive data discovery in S3. Think Macy. Storing and rotating passwords or API keys. Think Secrets Manager. Compliance and governance. Finally, let's talk about compliance and governance, which help organizations meet regulatory requirements and continuously monitor security posture. AWS Security Hub acts as a central security dashboard. It aggregates findings from services like GuardDuty, Inspector, AWS Config, and third-party tools, giving you a unified view of your security posture. Security Hub also checks your environment against industry standards such as CIS benchmarks. AWS Config continuously records and evaluates the configuration state of AWS resources. It helps answer questions like, who changed this setting? When did it change? Is this resource still compliant? This is essential for audits, governance, and enforcing security rules over time. AWS Audit Manager simplifies compliance audits by automating evidence collection for frameworks like PCI, DSS, HIPAA, and ISO. Instead of manually gathering logs and reports, Audit Manager pulls the required evidence automatically, saving time and reducing audit effort. Exam tip: configuration tracking. Think AWS Config. Centralized security findings. Think Security Hub. Audit evidence automation. Think Audit Manager. AWS security is layered and shared. IAM controls access. Encryption protects data. Monitoring detects risks. And compliance tools help you prove security and governance. Understanding which service solves which problem is exactly what the AWS exam tests. Take a moment to pause and review these services. You'll see them come up again and again in exam questions.
All right, so at this point, go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to read the question carefully and try to answer it on your own. Once you've made your choice, resume the video. Next, I'll walk you through a few clues to help you identify the correct answer.
All right, let's apply what we've just learned with a practical scenario. Imagine a company that wants to deploy a security solution built by a well-known third-party cybersecurity vendor, for example, an intrusion detection system or advanced threat protection tool, and they want to run it directly inside their AWS environment. Before choosing an answer, ask yourself a few guiding questions. Is this company looking for an AWS native service or a third-party solution? Do they need a place where AWS customers can discover, evaluate, and deploy commercial software that integrates directly with AWS services? Would this tool come from AWS itself, or from an external vendor that partners with AWS? Which AWS resource acts like a catalog or storefront for security, networking, and infrastructure software that can be deployed into your account? Keep those clues in mind as you review the options on the screen. In the next slide, we'll reveal the correct answer and explain why it's the best choice for this scenario. The correct answer is AWS Marketplace. AWS Marketplace is the official catalog where you can find, evaluate, and deploy third-party security solutions, such as intrusion detection systems, IDS, firewalls, endpoint protection, and SIEM tools, directly into your AWS environment. These solutions are provided by well-known cybersecurity vendors and are designed to integrate seamlessly with AWS services. The other options don't fit this use case. AWS Security Hub aggregates and visualizes security findings, but it doesn't sell or deploy third-party tools. AWS Artifact provides compliance reports and agreements, not software products. AWS Trusted Advisor gives recommendations and best practices, but it doesn't offer security tools for deployment. So whenever the question is about finding and procuring third-party security software for AWS, remember, AWS Marketplace is the right answer.
Thank you for watching. See you in the next class.